Welcome into Crossing Broadcast on a Monday. It's not the morning, it is the afternoon, and welcome in to Crossing Broadcast. You might notice this looks a little bit different. I've been working on some stuff. I've been kind of laying down some hints over time that I'm working on a new show. And so part of that is also trying to turn the office into something that maybe is a little bit more reflective of Philly sports. So I still have all those beautiful tiles that everybody's gotten used to, but they're on that side. So I'm testing some stuff out. Let me know if it sounds okay, if it looks okay. You can let me know in the comments. I can't fix my face. I can't fix the 5 head that I've got. So if it's really bad, then by all means, just let me know if it's even worse than anticipated. But welcome into the show. We have a lot to get into today. And I have to tell you this. I have a few things. The show that I'm working on, Craig and I have gone back and forth about a few times about, like, do I debut it this week? Do I do it next week when I'm on vacation? Do I do it the week after, which is post-draft? And I have to be honest with you. I find myself in these, like, moments of crippling, debilitating anxiety where I sit back and I, like, overthink stuff. And so there's, like, very much a part of me that says, like, I'm just going to go live tomorrow with a new show. And there's part of me that goes, well, why do that if you're going to go on vacation in a week and then have to take all of the equipment with you on a trip where you're supposed to be taking time off? So I don't know. I'm going to figure it out. But I can promise you, if you haven't done so already, go over to the Joy Media account over on YouTube. There will be an announcement there. There will be an announcement on Instagram and on Facebook and on X as well. But go subscribe over there so that you are apprised of when things happen. But anyway, welcome into the show. And I think that today's going to be a fun one. I've decided that I'm going to change up how the show is done a little bit today. And there's not really much of a rundown. You'll notice that on the thumbnail of the episode. Like, yes, there's Nick Castellanos, who sucks, who's been absolute dog shit for the Philadelphia Phillies, whose 0 for streak has now extended multiple series. We'll talk about him. We'll talk about whether or not Rob Thompson took way too long to come out against the Orioles on Sunday. Another disappointing series result following a disappointing one against the Red Sox. We'll get there as well. But I really have a problem with something going on with sports talk radio. And so we're going to talk about that as well. Because I think there's something that I expected to have happened by now that hasn't happened. And I'm genuinely, like, stuck in this nonstop loop. It feels like I'm in a dryer. I'm just in a tumble dryer trying to figure out when is somebody going to pull the nose up on sports talk radio and actually, like, get the conversation going with something meaningful. And I'm going to touch really quickly on 2 things that I didn't necessarily intend on before going live with the show. One is the Travis Konecny potential deal. We talked about it a lot on Snow The Goalie. It has not been discussed here on Crossing Broadcast, so we will get to that as well. And you'll notice that this over here, this is a sign from the inaugural season of the Philadelphia Union. And I'm hoping that, much like the Scotch tape that's holding it up, the Union season doesn't totally fall off the wall. Certainly feels like it's going that way. And I saw Kevin Kincaid posted something on Crossing Broad earlier today saying that it's time to admit that the golden era of Philadelphia Union soccer is over and it's time to rebuild. So we're going to get that squared away as well. So we'll get there a little bit later. Now, I don't want to dive into the Phillies too much. Okay, so I want to just touch on a couple of things. Nick Castellanos, I don't know if I have ever seen somebody that upsets me as much as Nick Castellanos does. Nick Castellanos' inability to go to the plate with a plan and execute that plan in any way that a professional hitter should is like all the worst parts of the end of Pat Burrell's career. Right-handed bat, guy that you know can hit for power. The difference, I think, we can all probably agree on is that Nick Castellanos has in the past put together seasons that are at or around 300. Pat Burrell, I never really expected to do that, pat the bat. Nick Castellanos has fallen off the map. And now I think you're in a spot where, as the Phillies, you have to have a serious conversation. If you're Rob Thompson, you have to have a serious conversation. Can we allow this guy to hit so high in the lineup and be an absolute void ahead of Bryce Harper? How many more games can you allow an absolute waste of space in the lineup ahead of Bryce Harper? And listen, it reared its ugly head in London, and I broke this down on last week's show, and I once again kind of railed on Nick Castellanos for having no plate discipline, for being given the green light to swing first pitch. You watch this series from over the weekend against the Orioles, one of those figure out where you are and how you stack up against the opposition. Castellanos came up small yet again. And this 0 streak has not only gone the Orioles series, not only gone the Red Sox series, like it's bad. I think it's 0 for his last 17, I believe. Like, this is bad. There's no way to spin it. If you're a Phillies fan, there's no way to spin it and say that Nick Castellanos has done anything to deserve being anywhere other than the bottom 2, bottom 3 of the lineup. He's that bad. And perhaps it's time to let him sit for a bit. You know, there have been a lot of questions about who's going to come out of the lineup when Trey Turner's back. And nobody's looked at Nick Castellanos, but like maybe it is time. Perhaps it's time to let him sit for a series. Maybe it's time for him to clear his head because clearly something isn't working and clearly something has fallen apart for him at the plate. This does not look like a professional hitter. This does not look like a guy who was brought in here to be really one of the top 2 right-handed bats in the lineup, up there with JT Realmuto, and then, of course, Bohm has been very good. But, like, you expected Nick Castellanos to be a guy who would hit for some power, but at least be able to get you some extra base hits, drive in some runs, and take some pressure off of the Bryce Harpers of the world. And he hasn't done it. It's only gotten worse in a week. So I will once again actively campaign it's time for Nick Castellanos to come out of the lineup. Doesn't have to be forever. He has no value on the trade market right now, so that's not even something you can explore. But at some point, if you're the Phillies and things have kind of not fallen apart, but they've lost 5 of their last 7 games, I wouldn't start sounding all the alarms yet. But when your team has started to fall in these harder times against better teams, it's time. Like it's time to make a change in the lineup. And I think that comes back to Rob Thompson. Rob Thompson sat back this weekend, and it was a little bit surprising to me to some extent, but Rob Thompson didn't look actively engaged in this series. There were moments that you felt like he waited too long to pull a pitcher, like Zach Wheeler on Sunday. We all know I believe Zach Wheeler is the true ace of the staff and has been ever since he signed here. But it was clear Zach Wheeler didn't have it yesterday. And yes, he was locked into what was supposed to be a pitcher's battle for the ages. But when he doesn't have it, it's time to pull him. And sometimes it sucks. And sometimes there is a bit of ego and there's pride involved. But Rob Thompson didn't meet the moment yesterday, and the game got away from the Phillies pretty quickly. And they had no shot. And then he goes out and he finally gets himself worked up and he gets into it with the home plate. And I don't know, like maybe you felt a little bit of something in that moment. I didn't. It just kind of felt like lip service at that point. So to me, that's a problem. I think that Rob Thompson has a little bit to do with what happened this past weekend. Now, again, the Phillies have far exceeded expectations. They still sit significantly ahead of the rest of the NL East. I don't think there's anybody right now who thinks that the Atlanta Braves, given where they are in the standings, are within an arm's reach of getting back into this thing in the next month. But if you start to get complacent and if you stop being actively involved in treating every game like it's just as important as every other game, like living in that moment that you need the win every day, when you start to get away from that and you start to kind of kick your feet back up, whether it's the players, whether it's the coaches, you start to see a potential historic collapse. I'm not saying that that's where the Phillies are going to end up. I am saying that there is potential here, that things could go sideways for this team in the not too distant future. Once Trey Turner comes back in, you also have to remember he's not going to be MVP quality Trey Turner. He's probably not going to be an all-star Trey Turner right away. It's going to take time for him to adjust to the lineup and adjust back to major league pitching. And if that's the case, there's another potential, not full black hole in your lineup, but that's a potential issue. And all of this is to go without saying that Stott hasn't exactly played particularly well in recent weeks either. I think a lot of people just like him. I don't know if it's that Bryson Stott has become the Chase Utley of this team, where people seem to think that he's infallible, and they seem to just be fine to... Maybe the difference is, with Utley, people expected greatness, and he tended to meet that moment, and even if he wasn't hitting, you saw the passion. And with Bryson Stott, it feels like everything that he does that's positive is kind of like found money, because there were no expectations for him going into the season. And in fairness, I don't really think there have ever really been significant expectations for Bryson Stott. But, like, he's also had some issues in this lineup. So the Phillies aren't done. They're not heading into a free fall. But all of those people who spent much of this season questioning whether or not the Phillies' record was more reliant and based on bad teams and taking on a low level of competition, those whispers are going to become louder. And once that narrative gets out there, if the Phillies don't turn this around and win a series, 2 out of 3 of the next series, those murmurs getting louder are going to create a narrative. And well, we know how Philly media likes to run with a narrative, which is actually going to lead us into the next thing, which is I still don't know why Philly Sports Talk Radio is obsessed with a quote from a week and a half ago with Jalen Hurts about Nick Sirianni. And I said on this show last week, and I will continue to say this because I genuinely do not give a shit who I upset at either station. At some point, someone has to put in another level of work. And I said last week that if you're WIP, you have no incentive right now to do anything other than talk about the Eagles. None. You own the rights to the games. You have this exclusivity of sorts with talent, with the players, where you don't hear Eagles players routinely being trotted out on the competition on 97.5. So if you're WIP, by all means, you have the right to have the conversation, to continue to beat the drum, to continue to try to stir some kind of controversy because Jalen Hurts wasn't effusive in his praise of Nick Sirianni a week and a half ago. And I still think that it's not great radio. I still think that it's kind of like low-hanging fruit. I still think that there's probably a way to still talk about the Eagles without that level of what I would kind of claim now as fabricated controversy. Like, have some discussions about the position battles. You're a month-ish away from training camp. And yes, everybody's going to talk about position battles, and we're going to get to the thing where all the beat writers are out, and they're tracking each and every throw that Jalen Hurts makes. And they're going to track how many drop balls, how many drop passes. And people are going to take that like gospel. And people are going to begin to craft narratives in their minds of, oh, well, A.J. Brown clearly doesn't want to be here because he dropped 2 passes in the first practice of training camp. Clearly doesn't want to be here. Or, oh, well, Saquon Barkley, it's a real concern. He dropped 3 passes in the first week of training camp. Does that mean he can't be used in the passing game? Like, that stuff will happen because that's just what happens with training camp. And I get that we're a month away. But can we at least try to have some kind of intelligent conversation around the team? Can we talk about whether or not Howie Roseman has blown it by not addressing the linebacker position yet again? Can we have the conversation of whether or not the young defensive backs taken in this draft are going to push the vets for starting spots on this opening day roster? Can we have that conversation? And again, I get it. Like, there is going to be repetition to it. I get it's going to be repetitive. It's going to be a little bit redundant because once training camp starts, we have those conversations and they pretty much go throughout the whole season. But why in June are people still stuck on a Jalen Hurts quote that we broke down last week and said, not ideal, but certainly not horrific, certainly not the most controversial thing that's ever been said. He was asked about Nick Sirianni being more open with the offense and being more open-minded and how they've adjusted. He's like, that's a good question. And like, should he have maybe lied? I don't know. Like, here's part of the problem, right? With Philly sports players, and really sports players in general, but especially in Philly, we expect a certain level of openness, of honesty. And then when the player gives that, other parts of the media run with that and try to craft a narrative around it. So Jalen Hurts goes out, and again, I don't want to totally relitigate this, but last week we did. We talked about it. He doesn't exactly go out of his way to say, hey, Nick Sirianni's been sitting down with Kellen Moore and myself and Saquon Barkley and the receivers, and, we've really been working together in a collaborative environment. He didn't say that. And like, maybe people thought that he should. I genuinely didn't care either way because it doesn't affect me. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter. It'll matter in training camp. It'll matter in the preseason. It'll matter in the regular season. I don't need Jalen Hurts to lie. So him giving a non-answer then opened up this potential thing where people started saying, oh, well, it's clear that there's an issue between the coach and the quarterback. Now, let's go to this quote that Craig pulled up on the screen. John Kincaid. Was this morning, Craig? Is that a nod? So John Kincaid this morning on 97.5, and I'm going to get to why the Fanatic especially has me kind of pissed in all of this. John Kincaid says, so don't give me this idea, this nonsense that, well, if Hertz doesn't think these good things about Sirianni, then he doesn't have to say them. Bullcrap. You're a leader. You're a leader. Do you want to create an opportunity for others to look in on you and your organization and say there's dissension? No. What you want is to put on a happy face, say the right things. There has to be something nice you could say about Nick Sirianni. That's bullshit, and it's stupid. And it genuinely, that aggravates me on a few levels. One, that quote is effectively saying, I would rather have Jalen Hurts lie than just be honest and give what's essentially a non-answer. John Kincaid is taking the standpoint of, I think that Jalen Hurts should somehow try to fabricate an answer or a reply that will be team-friendly, PR-friendly, even if he doesn't believe it. And that's the answer he should put out, instead of just saying, I don't know. Now, look, if that's where you stand on it, if you watch this show, let me know in the comments. And if you listen in the podcast feed after the fact and you want to tweet at me at Joy on Broad, by all means, please do so. But, like, I don't care. It's essentially a non-answer or it's a bullshit answer. Listen, I cover hockey. What do hockey players do? In most cases, hockey players don't give you an answer. Hockey players say, oh, it's all for the team, and all good team effort out there, and yeah, I don't know if I can really give you too much on that one. They don't give you an answer. Oh, it's a good team win. We win as a team, we lose as a team. You know who hates that? Hockey fans. You know who hate that? Hockey media. Doesn't give you anything to talk about. There's no personality in the league. The NFL has plenty of personality. There are just other guys maybe you need to hear from. Perhaps the assembled media, who I have taken to task with the Eagles for not actually doing their jobs and not being critical in times where it probably would behoove them, outside of a Jeff McClain and then an occasional person who comes in and asks a somewhat scathing question, do better. But that one quote from Jalen Hurts isn't enough, or shouldn't be enough, to get 3 days of sports talk radio out of it, let alone 10. And this is where I come back to this. If you're WIP and you have the Eagles, by all means, have fun. Talk about it. Create controversy. Do what you want, because you have the rights to the team. And ultimately, if that's what you guys want to do, fine. And if you're winning in the ratings book each and every time and you're blowing the Fanatic out of the water, you have no incentive to change it. None. Zero. Then I look at 97.5 and I once again say, what the hell are you people doing? Genuinely. Truly. Now, we do know that they've made a change at the top at Beasley in the market. Joe Bell, who was in this city for a very long time. Joe Bell, who I met with, along with Kevin Kincaid, Anthony Sanfilippo, Bob Wankel, Kyle Scott, at the 97.5 studios 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. 2019 into 2020? It was 2019, summer of 2019, 5 years ago. We sat down with Joe Bell. We had a conversation because the Fanatic wanted, I think I can talk about this now. I don't think anybody's going to care. We had a conversation with 97.5 and Crossing Broad 5 years ago about doing a content partnership, about the Crossing Broad people writing content that could also live on the 97.5 site. And part of what we wanted at the time was that our people, the Big Bet Bobs of the world who were covering the Phillies, and the Anthony Sanfilippos who were covering the Flyers, and the Kevin Kincaids who were covering the Sixers, might be people who are leaned on at times by the station, that there'd be synergy between the brands. And ultimately, there were a bunch of people at the Fanatic who I think really got upset about the notion of having a partnership with Crossing Broad, because Kyle Scott did a lot of things about Radio Wars, published some posts that were very critical of certain hosts. That continued with some of what Kinker was doing at the time. We certainly had no filter on it with Crossing Broadcast. And so ultimately, we didn't do it. The partnership, the written partnership, didn't happen. What we did instead was we took Crossing Broadcast, Crossed Up, and Snow the Goalie, and we put them on 610 ESPN, another Beasley station. A Beasley station that, by the way, people had to pay to be on air. People bought radio time on 610 ESPN to have their shows on AM airwaves. We did not. We were, I think, the only example of people who were getting paid by Beasley Media to go do shows. And when we did, part of the initial conversation that we had, which was with Joe Bell, Eric Johnson, who was the program director at 97.5, and Coach Camille, who was the assistant program director, became the program director, went to PHLY, sent those DMs. Very stupid. We had that conversation. We went off and did the shows on 610. We were told, don't expect any callers, don't expect anybody to really listen to the show, but put together some tape, put together some examples of episodes, and then send them to Eric Johnson and Coach Camille and CC Joe Bell, and then we'll have a conversation about having some of those shows on the weekend, potentially, with 97.5. This was 5 years ago. What happened? We took those 3 shows, and surprisingly, while Mike Missinelli was on the air at 97.5, we were getting people who were actively listening to 610 ESPN Radio, who were listening to those shows. And we were getting callers. It was crazy. It was insane. Why the hell should somebody listen to an AM station and call to talk about the Philadelphia Flyers or the Phillies at the time or around the Eagles? But they did, because we had an idea of what good radio could look and sound like. We actually had a pretty good thing going. And then the program director at 610 passed away. It was very sad. And then COVID shut the world down. And so then there went those shows. And I've talked about this a bunch, but there was a certain pipeline that we were kind of trying to set up, that Joe Bell was apparently trying to set up, that Eric Johnson and Coach Camille couldn't be bothered with, and instead put together weekend lineups year over year that just didn't get the job done. And in fact, I've heard from people around the station that the weekend ratings have been quite dismal for a very long time. And I'm not saying that as a negative reflection on anybody who goes into the station and works. I'm sure they all try very hard. But there's a difference between doing a show and making it interesting enough for people to tune in and to actively choose to go into the app or to go into their car and turn the dial from the station that has the Eagles and the Phillies. They got complacent. And so now I look at 97.5 and I come back. And I know this is very long, but I come back to where 97.5 is now. They don't have the rights to the Eagles. They don't have the rights to the Phillies. And yet, what I see on their social media, what they are choosing to put out on their social media are quotes and comments about bullshit that they shouldn't be engaged in. They are not providing a different outlet. They are not providing an alternative. And I know that I look through things in the lens of pro wrestling because I was a pro wrestling fan as a kid and I still enjoy it. But controversy creates cash, a very simple Eric Bischoff principle. And there's the less than, better than, and different than. They give you none of it. Why is 97.5 The Fanatic talking about the same quote from 10 days ago? They're not going to win in the ratings. So why copy what WIP is doing? Why go to the same talking points? Give people another option. Give them the in-depth analysis of whether or not the young defensive backs are going to push the vets. Bring in people who have scouted these players throughout college to do more of an in-depth breakdown. Am I truly to believe that if a station cares enough about its shows to then turn them into a podcast feed, that if you went out and got someone who spent the entire year scouting Cooper DeJean, if they went and scouted him the whole year, I'm supposed to believe that if you did a 20-minute segment with a person who scouted that player actively, that radio people would tune out, that the Fanatic audience would tune out, that they wouldn't want to learn more about that player because they would rather turn the dial and listen to people argue about a Jalen Hurts quote from 10 days ago. Am I truly to believe that? I don't. I think that's why you see so many people online, especially on social media, in some of the more toxic places, complaining actively. Why isn't there an alternative? Why aren't people doing these things differently? I don't get it. I genuinely don't understand. There's a way to do this. I mean, I'm not beholden to Nielsen ratings. I guess that's great. It's not like this show has 6,000 people tuning in. I'm also not getting paid $300K or $200K to do this show and have 115 people or 150 people live streaming it like some other outlets do. I don't know. I don't know what we're doing here. I genuinely think that it's almost like we're living in this like weird political realm where it's like everybody says they're in the middle. More people than not say, I don't like these people. I don't like these people. I'm more in the middle. And then you go to the polls and you see elections and it's like, well, it's very polarized. Were they telling the truth? A lot of people say, I don't like the controversy or running with what is perceived to be a nonsense controversy on one station. And then there's this other station over here that's doing the same thing. And all these people who are disaffected, I don't know where they're going for their sports content. But there's a station right over here that has the chance to do something different, and they don't. And they've changed program directors a few times. And maybe the guy who's there now will change it. David Berkowitz says over on YouTube, they know they're dead in the water and they're just waiting to get the axe. If that's the case, it's a shame because there are good people at the Fanatic. There are people who are actually good at their job. And listen, the Mike Missinelli rumor is still out there. I don't blame him, by the way, for not taking that job yet in middays. The smart thing would be for him to wait until football season and to come in and try to spur part of a potential resurgence for the station in the fall. Why create a contrived argument or debate about Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni now in June? Mike Missinelli is doing very well financially. He has like the wine business and a bunch of other ventures that he does. Enjoy the summer. Come back for football season. It makes sense. I don't blame him. I fully expect that's what's happening. And if they can't get him, I don't know what the hell they're going to do because there aren't that many people out there. I know that I have long posited the theory that when John Marks left WIP, to me, the only two places for him to go were PHLY to do a show that either led into Gargano or came out of Gargano, or for him to kind of ride in like a knight in shining armor to take over the afternoon show that wasn't getting any better, or even if it was a marginal improvement. If you were to start the fall book and Mike Missinelli takes over middays and John Marks competes with his old show in the afternoon, there's intrigue. And maybe there's a path there. I know John Marks has said, and even on this show with me, that he had no interest in doing sports talk radio in the afternoon. That commute into the city, Bala-Cynwyd, from where he lives and where I live, really isn't that much better. But I don't know, that's at least intriguing. That's certainly a way to get some people to turn heads. All right, I've done enough. I've done enough about radio. Craig is smirking. I can't wait to find out if I went too far on anything after the show. I don't think I did. But again, we don't need to have this thing where there's this bullshit debate for something that doesn't exist or doesn't need to exist. And Ford, I'm going to go to Ford here. Says right now on Twitter, 97.5 has the John Kincaid soundbite about how as the leader, Jalen's supposed to say something nice about Nick Sirianni. That's the quote we were talking about before. So contrived, so boring, people are smarter. And maybe that's it. Maybe where a lot of the Phillies sports fans are going right now is neither side. Maybe they're not listening to what they're annoyed with at WIP, and maybe they're not going to what is essentially the same conversation on The Fanatic. Maybe they're just tuning out. Maybe they're tuning back into podcasts or they're listening to music for the next few months, and then they'll come back around football season. But I think Ford's right. I do think that there are people who are smart enough to know that this is all nonsense. Do better. Again, if you're WIP, you don't have any reason to do anything different. You don't have any reason to change anything. You're doing fine. You're winning the ratings books. But if The Fanatic, what are you doing? Fix it. Soon. Please. Somebody fix it. Josh White says it's sad that these are the only two options. They are. It's interesting. I have not gotten confirmation on what exactly it was, but I did see a week or two ago, maybe it was 3 weeks, there was a video that John Barchard put up, and it looked like an iHeartRadio logo in the back, and it was him, and it was Sean Brace, and there was somebody else, and there was kind of like a tease, and so I don't know if that means they're trying to create a third station. I know that Fox the Gambler is a station in Philly, and that those people work hard and they try hard, so I'm not trying to shit on them. But I don't know what the frequency of the station is. And I know that there are like a whole bunch of different ones. And it seems like depending on where you're at, you have to change the frequency. I don't think they've gotten a huge foothold. Maybe they're trying to do something with iHeart. Maybe they're trying to expand or I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. Do people get excited? Like if there's a third station come football season that's anchored by John Barchard and Sean Brace and the people who are at the Gambler and maybe some of the people who used to work with Barchard on Bleeding Green Nation or at some of the SB Nation blogs, like does that move the needle? I don't know. Maybe it'll be another option. Maybe it'll be another alternative. Maybe we'll have 4 sports talk radio stations in Philly. Oh, God. God help us. All right, so there's that. Let's just let that one kind of pass, okay? Now, I want to get to something that actually does matter. And it matters in Philly sports, and it's not total bullshit. And I want to touch really quick on the NBA Finals at the end. We'll get there in a second. But this one actually has to do with the Philadelphia Flyers. Click, 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 click. Oh, man, people are clicking out of the show because they don't want to hear about the Flyers. All right, it's fine. Travis Konecny, not Matvei Mishkov. David Berkowitz is asking about Mishkov. We have no update on Mishkov. We have no idea. I saw a video of him working out with resistance bands. I wish him all the best. It's great. Travis Konecny is getting close to a potential contract. And actually, Craig, pull up that last thing there from Caleb, asking about Paul George. Remind me about that. I meant to have that with Joel Embiid and Paul George. We'll get there after this thing with Konecny. Paul George and also like the alleged picture of LeBron James. We'll get there as well. Travis Konecny, there have been rumors that a contract could be in the process of being negotiated with the Flyers. We have argued about this ad nauseum on Snow The Goalie. But there is a growing notion that he might push for close to $10 million a year. And now, if you have any idea about what hockey contracts look like, you'll know that $10 million in hockey is a lot of money for a player. The cap is around $82 million. It's going to go up to, I believe, $88 million for next season. So at that point, you're figuring that $10 million is about what? You're at, it's more than 10% of your cap. 12% of your cap is 96. 12.5% of your cap going to a Travis Konecny contract doesn't seem like a good way to allocate your funds. But there are people who believe that he's worth that money. Or there are people who believe that Travis Konecny at that kind of money is going to be a bargain in a few years because players of his ilk who can be 30-ish goal scorers are going to be making in excess of $10 million. That in 2 or 3 years of the cap going up, they're going to get paid $12 to $13 million a year. That is insane just on its face. But in fairness, this is something that has happened in the NBA. As the NBA cap continued to go up, we saw role players getting paid what the biggest stars in the league had gotten paid. We saw Tobias Harris making $39 million a year. There was a time when Kobe Bryant at the end of his career was getting around 30, and people thought it was insane. And you could make the argument that he was worth more to the Lakers just from an optics standpoint than he was on the court, and it was more of like a legacy payment. But Tobias Harris made $39 million. We're going to get to the point where players are going to make $50+ million a year in the NBA. And so all of the numbers that were once set as this is what a role player should make, 8 million, maybe 10 million, perhaps 13, those numbers are going to keep going up. So hockey's now experiencing it because after multiple years of a flat cap, we're going to start to see role players getting paid what star players were getting paid. And star players who are lucky enough, like Leon Draisaitl, who are going to be coming up for new deals, are going to be able to push the threshold for what a star player is supposed to get paid. They're going to be able to push that even higher. The ceiling will rise. Travis Konecny is a wonderful player. He is a very good player. He is arguably the best player, at least best offensive player that the Flyers have. But he can't make $10 million with this team. And I don't care that the cap is going up because ultimately you have a few things working against you if you're Travis Konecny. One, there is a case to be made, although I'm not totally sure that I want to make it, that players, sometimes you have a good player on a bad team who compiles stats because bad teams still need goal scorers. Bad teams still need guys who rack up points. I'm not sure that he's that guy. I don't think that he's only a byproduct of being on a bad team and someone has to get the points. I think he's better than that. I do think that if he moved on to a better team, he would still perform at a high level. But when you look relative to the other top forwards and the other top wings in this league, he's not worth $10 million. You could maybe talk me into saying $9 million on a 5-ish year contract. Now, on Snow The Goalie, we've had this argument. Bundy, I think, has kind of been in the middle of my take, and Anthony's take is more of a, well, he's worth that. The cap is going up. You're going to have to pay 10 plus, 11 plus. 10 plus, you're just going to have to deal with it. Maybe he'll take 9.5 if you do a 7-year contract. And this is where I come back to, we need to have full disclosure. Although many of you have not met me in person, Josh White has. He's a student of mine. I'm not 6'5". I know this is going to come as a surprise. I know that I exude a lot of confidence and tall guy energy. I know. But I'm not. Travis Konecny is roughly the same size as me. Now, I'm pretty sure we also weigh about the same. Now, I have dad bod. He doesn't. He's a dad, but he doesn't have dad bod. He has hockey player bod. I say this because when you are at my stature and Travis Konecny's stature, and you play a certain way, your body's not going to hold up the same way. It just won't. The guys that you can look at longevity-wise, who are like anywhere from 5'6" to 5'8", that weighed maybe anywhere between $170 and $185, the number of guys who performed at an elite level or close to an elite level, a top-line winger level, and had a career that spanned into their late 30s is not high. Danny Briere is an anomaly. Martin St. Louis is an anomaly. They are not the norm. And neither of them played with an incredibly physical style. So all of this is to say, I think he's a wonderful player. And I think that if the Flyers re-signed him for 5 years at like $8.5, $9 million, it ends up being okay value. And I think that by the end of that contract, there's still value if you ultimately decide you want to trade him. But the problem is, if you give a guy 10 plus million, 11 plus million to be that guy and pay him for 6 or 7 years at that number, I don't care that cap is coming, that more cap is coming. That is a waste. That is burning money. That is actively choosing to cook all of your food in avocado oil because you think it's going to be healthier for you. It's still oil. Craig is going to get upset. I think Craig's vegan. I don't actually know if he is. He's going thumbs down. I don't believe him. But you can't burn cap for the sake of burning it. And that's what they'd be doing if they go 10 million. It's not worth it. And as the NHL draft approaches, 2 weeks, which also kind of coincides with the NBA draft, they're going to have this conversation. They might even finalize a deal. And to me, I come back to, it's a new era of orange, but you have to be careful that you don't fall into the same sins of the past, which is taking a guy who's good, who's one of your better players, and extending him to a contract that is in line with what a better player on a much better team would get paid, that a more impactful player could make. I actively am in the position where I say, I think the Flyers should explore a trade of Travis Konecny. Not because he's not a good guy, not because he's not a good performer. I just genuinely believe that the best value for him is an open market feeding frenzy. Get some picks, get another change of scenery prospect or two, try to find a guy who's akin to like what Owen Tippett was, find a guy who a franchise has become disillusioned with, who you believe could blossom under John Tortorella or whoever the next coach is going to be, and go about it that way. And then in a year or two, when Mishkov comes over, you can parlay those assets together and go out and get a guy who's even better than Travis Konecny, who at that point will be the same age that Konecny is now, maybe even younger, and you can give him that contract and feel better about it. We're going to find out in the next week or two if something is seriously going on there. Josh White asks, would you trade Konecny to Ottawa for the 7th pick? No, I wouldn't, because this isn't the draft to do it. If it had been last year, 100%. Not this draft. And I get the fact that like every year you have analysts who will come out and say, hey, there are 3 really great players, and then there's another tier from like 4 to 10, and then it falls off a lot. This draft is kind of, it's like Celebrini, and then it feels like there's not a huge gap between him and number 2, but then the gap between number 2 and number 16 really isn't going to be that big. I don't think this is the year. I would much rather see them trade Travis Konecny for a first-round pick in next year's draft, or get a conditional pick, get multiple picks, get a prospect. But again, feeding frenzy, get assets. There's no reason not to. We'll talk more about that on Snow the Goalie later this week. Let's get back to the Sixers. I think that's it. I think I will end on the Sixers because there were two things that happened over the weekend that were of interest. One, there was a picture put out, it might have been on Friday, of what appeared to be LeBron James and Nick Nurse at the Four Seasons. And I believe Pagan's the one who put it out on the Crossing Broad Twitter. But the question was posited, hey, does this look like LeBron James to anybody? And there were some people who said, yes, absolutely it does. That is definitely LeBron James. Now, you're still in a tampering window, so it'd probably not be a great idea to actively have a conversation in public at the Four Seasons with LeBron James. But then I saw Spike Eskin put out that he had it on good authority that it was Elton Brand. I don't doubt that Spike is right. I would assume that text may have come from Daryl Morey, who's a listener of Rights to Ricky Sanchez, has been on their show a bunch of times. But in that picture, at least, it did not look like Elton Brand. Again, it could have been. Maybe it even was. Certainly looked a little bit more LeBronian to me than Elton Brandian. But, all right, so if LeBron's not coming to town, or if LeBron is not actively being courted by your team, your town, your Philadelphia 76ers, there was one guy who was. And, Craig, I don't know if you can find it quickly enough. I think it was on the Crossing Broad X account. But Joel Embiid hopped on the panel at the NBA Finals. I believe I had a game 4 on Friday. So Friday? It was Friday. And Paul George was also at the desk. And it came out over the weekend, I believe Pagan wrote about this on Sunday, that Joel Embiid wasn't even supposed to be on the panel. But then he heard that Paul George was going to be on set. And so what Joel did, Craig, take that off the screen really quick, pull it up, and then the video's embedded in it. Because Joel Embiid did like the thing that he does, right? He calls himself Troll Embiid, right? He is in a way a troll. But sometimes it's in a good way. Embiid goes on the set, and he's asked about what the team will have to do this offseason to get better. So, Craig, let's pull that up, and we'll play the audio here as well. There we go.
Great city, great fans. Obviously they got some great players, but he hurts me a lot. So hopefully, this offseason we find a way to get better and, add some pieces. And, to be honest, that question should have went to both of them. Great city, great.
All right, so the content, the actual audio clip itself, whether you can hear it clearly or not, isn't really the point. It's the visual. It's the face that Joel Embiid made. He said, add some pieces. And it was very, with the eyes, the side eye, at Paul George. Now, I've said this a bunch of times. Paul George 3 years ago would have been a perfect fit. Would have been the guy I absolutely would have backed up the Brinks truck for. 1,000%. I like Paul George, the player. I think Paul George, the player, fits perfectly with Tyrese Maxey and with Joel Embiid. I think that if 3 years ago, if you could pull that Paul George out of the timeline and drop him here, that Paul George would have been a perfect player to pair with Maxey, Embiid, and then fill it out with some role players. And I think you actually could have had a shot of being maybe not the best team in the East, which very clearly Boston is, but you would certainly have a case for the second best team where you'd be kind of battling it out with Milwaukee. And I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to maintain my objectivity in this because there is part of me that thinks signing Paul George to a long-term contract at his age, given his shortcomings in the postseason, is effectively a waste of money and truly would just compound a lot of the negative sentiment that people had for Tobias Harris and just kind of put it on to Paul George. And there is a very clear-minded part of my brain that says, it's Tobias Harris 2.0. It's actually worse than Tobias Harris 2.0. Because even though the Sixers gave Tobias Harris that really bad contract, we all knew he sucked. We all knew Tobias Harris was bad. Nobody thought that he was worth a max contract. We all actively questioned why the Sixers bet against themselves and why they gave him that deal when no one else would have, except maybe Detroit. But if it's Paul George, it can't happen. There's no way to take the blame away from the Sixers. If they sign Paul George, there's no, hey, he outperformed the contract. It doesn't exist. The expectations are going to be that he's that guy from 3 years ago, that he's that guy from 4 years ago, and he's not that guy anymore. And if you were pissed off and annoyed by James Harden's laissez-faire mentality in his inconsistency in the playoffs where he can go off in one game and totally disappear for 3 more, that's what Paul George will give you. And yet there's still part of me that says, all right, if Daryl Morey goes out and signs Paul George, I'll come on this show and I will probably say, all right, it's better than Tobias, which it would be. But if we're being fair here, we all know that that would not be a good long-term solution for the Sixers. Ultimately, any guy they go out and sign, the goal has to just be the next 2 years. Because Joel Embiid's health is the ultimate question mark each and every year. It will continue to be the ultimate question mark. That will never change until he retires. So if you're trying to maximize the next 2 years, I have been on record. I will continue to be on record. LeBron James is the play. LeBron James, the shadow GM, could be the guy to bring in the role players that can help to fill out a roster around himself and Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. If you can't do that, if you can't get LeBron James to the Four Seasons to have a meeting with Nick Nurse and Paul George is the guy you go with, fine. But I'm not so sure it's going to work. But we'll find out because, again, the NBA draft 2 weeks away. Could we see a deal at the draft? Could we see a deal shortly thereafter? Will the LeBron rumors start to pick up? If JJ Redick, his co-host on the podcast, ends up being the Lakers head coach, does that push him to stay in LA? And if so, does that fundamentally change the entire market for Paul George and potentially on the trade market for Jimmy Butler? It could. And I fully expect that the Sixers are going to be in on both of those guys. We'll see how it plays out. Last thing, tonight, NBA Finals Game 5. We'll be writing about it all day over on Crossing Broad. You head over to the sports betting section. You can go take advantage of some of the best offers, which I'm not going to mention on the screen here because if I do, then the compliance teams reach out and I have to go back in and add things into the videos about, responsible gambling and all that. But you can go over to crossingbroad.com, find the best offers that are available for the NBA Finals. They're in like the sports betting section of the site. They'll be there between now and tonight, so you can go find what the best offers are. But the Mavericks were able to pull out a significant win in Game 4, an absolutely lopsided and truly embarrassing loss for the Celtics. And yet everything goes back to Boston, and there's a question now. Could tonight be the night that Kyrie Irving turns back the clock, becomes the absolute assassin he was for Cleveland when they toppled an incredible Warriors team? Can tonight be the night that Kyrie steps up in a big way on Boston's court, picks up a win with Luka Doncic and the rest of the Mavs, and potentially forces a Game 6 back at Dallas? And then you never know. You get a win back in Dallas, then it goes back to Boston for Game 7. How does it... I have a very bad feeling, as many of you probably do as well, that Boston is going to win tonight and that they'll probably do it in resounding fashion. I will simply point out the fact that one thing I have been consistent about, I was consistent about this for the last few years in the playoffs with Boston, Jason Tatum actively doesn't look like he wants to play in the NBA Finals. He has moments where he contributes to the team in other ways, but Jason Tatum has these moments where I genuinely don't know what he's doing on the court. Jaylen Brown actually looks like the better player, which I never thought was going to be the case. Jaylen Brown has had moments in this series where he looks like not only Boston's best player, but their best player by a significant margin. I fully expect Jason Tatum tonight, for whatever reason, to make this the game that he's going to show up in the fourth quarter. But I will say that if Dallas is able to win and force Game 6 back at Dallas, the series could be over. Very well could be over. Because Boston has had a little bit of a recent history of the going gets tough and they fall apart. Right now, they're riding high. Game 4, they'll view as an anomaly. And then we'll see. A Dallas win tonight on Boston's home court could really rattle a Celtics team that would then start feeling, oh no, it's happening again. Jose Nunez says to Kyrie, the ball is always flat. That's a good place to end the show today. I want to thank everybody who tuned in live. Let me know in the comments or after the fact in the podcast feed. You can let me know over on Twitter, X, at Joy on Broad. Did you like the new setup? Did the audio sound okay? Was it better? Was it worse than normal? Let me know because I'm going to tweak things. And as I asked you before, it's in the description of the episode. Head over to the Joy Media account over on YouTube. Subscribe there. I'll have an announcement coming up at some point soon for a new show. Continue doing Crossing Broadcast on Mondays. But it's something I'm really looking forward to. So if you've been on this ride with me since 2017 with the original Crossing Broadcast, continue taking a ride with me on something else too that I'm working on that I'm very excited about. So big thank you to everybody who tuned in. Big thank you to everybody who joined live. And those of you who listen after the fact in the podcast feed. Kinker will be back on Thursday. I don't know if he has a guest. You'll have to tune in to find out here on Crossing Broadcast, everyone's favorite Philly sports podcast. Talk to all of you very soon.